Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Star Wars video. This is going to be the next video in my Star Wars Rewatch series as we build up to Rise of Skywalker, of course. So we did Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, last week. That means, of course, Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, this week. So often the most criticized of the original 6 movies, the one I think most people probably places as 6 out of 6 with those ones. Going back to it here, it's of the prequels, given that I really love the prequels, it's definitely the movie I have watched the least. But every time I do watch it, I gain sort of a new appreciation for it, because in many ways, this is kind of like the most complicated Star Wars movie we've had so far. Because the amount it has to do, it has to set up an entire war. And a more complicated war than either of the other two that the series kind of covers. The Rebellion versus the Empire, then the Resistance versus the First Order. To the point where, you know, we get the setup just by virtue of where the prequel trilogies go on Rebels Empire. We don't really get any setup for Resistance First Order. This needs a lot of setup, because where we start at the start of this movie, we don't have a clone army. We're introduced to the idea of the Separatists, and because we find out that the Trade Federation is part of that, okay, there's an army, but an army that was previously defeated, so they need to improve. So this movie has to set up 2 entire armies, plus get across the idea that it is Palpatine again doing that manipulation. Have the Jedi kind of get close to discovering all of it, but not quite, and then lead into the idea of they think this is the best way to kind of go about defending things, but it's kind of just playing into the hands of the Sith overall. Plus a lot of character stuff, like you have to really develop Obi-Wan and Anakin's dynamic here, Anakin and Padme, and so on as the movie progresses, and I think it does a pretty good job at that. Like, I think the biggest criticism that could be leveled at this movie is purely just that, yes, there are a handful of scenes where the dialogue is a bit, you know, overly dramatic is probably the way I'd say it. It's not even that it's like bad, it gets the point across, the dialogue. You never lose track of what's going on just because it's like really, really bad dialogue, but it's just like, yeah, maybe could have done with an extra pass. But it also fits in many ways with, like, it's meant to be this really intense, dramatic relationship. It's meant to be kind of, you know, Romeo-Juliet, this relationship that, you know, was almost not meant to be, and they know going into it that it will ultimately lead to ruin for themselves and kind of much more by committing to this. And I think because we know ultimately where it goes, that's the approach that they took of, like, you know, it is just this sort of kind of spur of the moment. It just happens. The two of them just go on with it and eventually come together. I think it works for what they're going for, and I think, you know, Episode 3 being what it is, I think helps it further to get that across. And then, like, I'm not even talking yet about the whole, you know, they have the Anakin and his mother plot kind of come back as well. So, just in terms of, like, presenting what this movie just discusses at all, it covers so many things. And I'll open with world building, I suppose, which was one of the key points I talked about in my Phantom Menace kind of a rewatch video. And again, I think this movie delivers on that so well. Episode 1 had, you know, we went back to Tatooine, but a different section of Tatooine. It wasn't just the same place we were in the originals. So we got to see a little bit more of how Tatooine works. We get a kind of, again, a little bit more of that in terms of, like, okay, we get to see sort of both sides of it. We see the sort of transition point across both sides of Tatooine, going from, what's it, Mos Espa, which is the kind of prequel stuff, to Mos Eisley, and then, you know, going all the way out to the Lars homestead. So that was very cool to see that, and just get across the idea that they are just 2 sections of the same planet, and so you can visit both of them when you're there, and that's exactly what happens here. You also get to see more new planets and more new species, so we get to go to Kamino and get to meet the Kaminoans, the cloners, who are a very kind of unique looking species, of course. Very specific with their like advanced technology, their specialization, and so on. Their ocean planet that their technology has allowed them to sort of almost like evolve out of. It's very interesting in that like you sort of want to know like the species history of Camino, the Kaminoans and stuff like that. Of like, are they good in the water themselves or what? But we also get to go to Geonosis and see the Genosians and the fact that they're like this kind of hive mind species, kind of very bug-like, and it seems like only a handful of them are kind of, you kind of almost fully consider fully sentient. So very, very interesting. Plus, while we're on Geonosis, we're introduced to more of the separatist leaders, and that, okay, from episode 1, of course, they bring back the Trade Federation with the Nemoidians and Newt Gunray and so on. Poggle the Lesser is, of course, the Genosian leader. Sandhill, who's the leader of the banking clan, who are, of course, Munes, which is the species that Darth Plagueis is, which is very, very interesting, just that we do get to meet that species. The Techno-Union army is kind of course, why we have other kind of droids involved here as well. So I think it's all well explained in this movie. I think while there are definitely a few, hanging threads coming out of this, mainly around the whole, how exactly does the whole Cypher Diaz thing work? That's that definitely asks a lot of questions, begs a lot of questions. But I think that most of those questions are answered across both the Star Wars Bounty Hunter video game, and also Season 6, the Lost Missions of the Clone Wars, has an arc that covers some stuff with Cypher Diaz as a kind of finding out about it. So they eventually get there, but I think that the movie gets across the general kind of point here of like, here's this kind of almost roguish Jedi that ordered this clone army, but then, Count Dooku is clearly, taken over control of that himself, and is hired Jango Fett, and there's playing on both sides here to add into the whole, this is the plan of the Revenge of the Sith coming together here as they form this war on both sides. Very, very directly in control of the Separatists, and then more subtly on the Republic side of things here. And then politically, we also do get an interesting one here in that, again, like, I think people level the political thing at this movie as well, but there's really only like 2-3 scenes in the Senate here, and they really do focus in on just the important things of like, we can't decide to just have an army given that Padme and a bunch of other senators are super, super against the idea of giving the Republic the power to have an army themselves. You need to vote the Supreme Chancellor to have emergency power to allow that to happen. And he engineers a situation where Padme has to be kind of sort of taken into, protected and be protected away from everything because of all the assassination attempts, which he is behind, of course. And with her out of the picture, he takes advantage of, who the fill-in is, which is Jar Jar. And again, just like, wow, Jar Jar being used in a more serious position here. And they don't overuse him in this movie. It's just, you can tell in the 10 years that have passed between 1 and 2, he has become a more composed character, to the point where Padme trusts him to keep things in check while she's gone. And obviously with how intense things are getting, like, can you really criticize Jar Jar that much for going along with it? And that by all accounts, he gives a decent speech that actually gets the vote passed. And it's a key moment that this is going to be ultimately where the vilification of the Jedi really comes in episode 3 is over. Palpatine hasn't stepped down from these emergency powers since then, and when will he? So that's where that comes in. What else here do I want to go in? Again, there's so much to talk about with this movie. I suppose I'll get into just Anakin and Obi-Wan. It's really interesting because 10 years have passed that they really have to just fast track that relationship. And it's clear, it's just like, over the course of the movie, you find out that Anakin really does consider Obi-Wan a sort of father figure at this point. And it's going to be interesting to see, as we go into episode 3, how it transitions into being more of like brothers, of course, as Anakin gets kind of as Anakin, actually becomes a man, I suppose. It transitions from being kind of father-son type thing to being more kind of older brother, little brother, and and this is where I think it's probably the biggest thing that stands out in all of this is that Hayden Christensen's performance here was always really torn apart at the time, and that people hated this movie because, like, he's so whiny and stuff like that. But looking back on it here, it's like this is the core of sort of how you do this sort of a character arc. You have a character at this sort of transitional point in their life, a flawed character who they already set up in episode 1. His thoughts always dwell on his mother, and it hasn't stopped in the last 10 years. The dreams that he's had, and the fear over what could or could not happen. The promise from the first one of, like, he would come back to free her someday. And we see him eventually have to go ahead with that, and he fails. Like, that is a huge thing for this type of character. For the character who is, like, overly attached, who isn't able to fully let go of his attachments in any way, that it tears him apart when he loses someone. And you see that happen here with the really heavy, dark side kind of moment of him slaughtering the Tusken Raiders out of pure revenge, which is not the way of the Jedi. But because the thing with his mother was so well set up, you see the kind of path that he's going to go down. And so the only thing that sort of keeps Anakin from utterly falling apart at this moment is the fact that him and Padme have sort of come together as a couple pretty much at this point. And what happens is, rather than it just being Padme sort of helps him get over the loss of his mother, it's sort of this just sort of transference of he feared losing his mother, now he's fearing losing Padme, and that's exactly what happens. That the core issue of his attachments, like, never properly gets dealt with here in the correct way. In part, I suppose, because of some of the secrecy around the fact that they keep the relationship secret, but it's well set up in that regard. I think that's what kind of stands out in this movie, is that it does have a lot of ground to cover, but it gets through a lot of the information fairly well, and that, like, we have, like, a Death Star set up in this, so much, I think, direct setup of, like, stuff for episode 3 of these little things of, like, teased here that will kind of come to pass in the next movie. And I think that's what works about this movie. Where it doesn't work sometimes is, again, like I said, some of the dialogue in some of the more kind of intense scenes with, Anakin and Padme. But I still feel like it overall gets the point across, in that, like, you can look at this movie and be like, it makes no sense how these two come together as a couple. But I also completely get why that happens. They ultimately both acknowledge it at one point in this movie to each other, that over the last 10 years they have sort of thought about each other a lot. And for Anakin, it's very much, the second he sees her and sees that she hasn't, like, changed drastically, he's kind of all in that, like, this is the person that he wants to be with. With her, of course, it takes a little bit of getting to, I suppose, know Anakin, because he has changed a lot. But, it's just realizing that he is a very competent Jedi in training, that despite the age difference, he is at an age where he can actually have those sort of discussions with her about, like, they have their sort of different views, but they can have an interesting discussion together. And I think most importantly, sort of for both of them, is this idea of, like, their duty sort of keeping them from having, a family, a relationship, because Anakin as a Jedi is not meant to have one, and then Padme is just usually so busy being a senator, and, the way they sort of characterize that is that, the senators are covered by, like, the hollow news and stuff like that so much that, she doesn't want, like, her personal life, out there. So the idea of, what if they just get together in secret and keep it a secret, and so when they have free time, they're a couple, but other than that, no one actually knows that it actually works for them. I think the only thing missing from this is actually a scene that is covered in the novelization of Attack of the Clones, which is that when they're on Naboo together, they do actually have like a scene. I can't remember it exactly. Like, is it before this where like Padme's on her own, or is it with Anakin? I think it is with Anakin, but it's maybe a scene where she gets to talk to her sister just on her own, and her sister actually has a bunch of kids, so she has a full family, and her sister's like asking her like, do you not want to have a family yourself? And kind of Padme's just like, no, my duty and stuff like that. But you can tell throughout that entire scene that it is actually something that is on her mind. She would like to have a family someday, and it's just, the fact that she's so focused that, the duty that she's given, like the fact that she does have that transition from queen to senator. It's interesting that she is perfect for that role, and they place an importance on her in this movie, and even in episode 1, that it's why she wouldn't have the time to have a family. So just kind of doing it in secret, it's like it's where it kind of works in that sense, and why you make the comparison to a sort of Romeo and Juliet type thing. It's why the Across the Stars is the kind of romance musical theme, and it really fits it with the ideas. So it's like that, things would have gone so differently if this relationship didn't happen, if they made different decisions, but they did, and because of everything that happened, it really accelerated them coming together, of just her needing to be there for him with the loss of Shmi. That definitely amplified things. The fact that there's all these crazy situations happening, and they are close already, but then they get closer as that happens. You get, these kind of them both saving each other over and over again, why they sort of do eventually come together. And it's a good setup for like this intense relationship that only gets more intense in terms of how Anakin feels about it as like we go into episode 3, which is why he is so upset about the idea that the same thing that happened to his mother is potentially going to happen to Padme. So that's really well done, along with probably the biggest setup from 2 to 3, him wishing that one day he'd be powerful enough to stop people from dying. And I love that is so heavily brought back in episode 3 with the Plagueis story, that Palpatine tells him that Palpatine knows Anakin enough to be like, this is the thing that will get me Anakin on my side. This is the final thing I can say to him that will fully turn him. And it works so well. And it's a moment like this between movies that show that the prequels were super well planned out. And it's stuff like this that I don't think we've seen in the sequel trilogy. And I really don't think we'll see in terms of 7 and 8 setting up stuff for 9. The difference between 3 movies that were clearly planned out to be 3 movies, and from the start they pretty much knew where they were going in the end, versus 3 movies that were clearly just done one at a time, and no real clear-cut plan of like 7 to 8 to 9, and that's why we hear constant stories, constant rumors about chopping and changing of this and that, reshoots and stuff like that. And it's so kind of clear to see of like the thing I'll always give the prequels is that it's a well laid out story that has depth in its plot, has character development, and has good action. Like there's just it hits some clear-cut, clear notes that make it good Star Wars for me. And I like the more in-depth, complicated plot that we do have here. So, a lot of that stuff with Anakin, like I said, is just like, I can understand, someone like watching this movie and being like, oh, Anakin's a bit hard to take in this movie at some times. But again, it's a complicated role here that he has to play, where he has to be the sort of the young, cocky, Jedi, arrogant, in some ways, and be that sometimes. He has to have this unique relationship with Obi-Wan, then this very kind of passionate relationship with Padme, while also having, the heavy emotions around, first wanting to save his mother and then dealing with the loss of her and stuff like that. I think it does a good job, given that it is a very complicated emotional role. I think he is at his best, Hayden Christensen, in episode 3. And it's why I think, after all these years, I think people have ultimately reflected on it enough to be like, we kind of need Hayden Christensen in episode 9. Like, in that, like, I think for a lot of people, episode 9 is not going to be complete. No matter what they do, it's not going to be complete unless they have Anakin in it somewhere. And it has to be Hayden as Anakin. And I think they really, really need to do that. If it is the end of the Skywalker saga, if they're making it 9 movies all connected together, how can you not have your chosen one in episode 9? That's the big thing. But yeah, let's move on to some other stuff here. Like, I suppose let's cover Obi-Wan's kind of plot that he gets to have on his own here. This is definitely one of my highlights from Attack of the Clones, is the Obi-Wan investigation plot that we get to have here, as he investigates the Dart to try and find out who was it that killed Zam Wesell, to kind of lead them off the track. And it's just really well done, because like he goes to his old friend Dex, who, you know, again, new species that we get introduced to, very unique. They bring it back in like the Clone Wars, like Pong Krell is one of this species as well. Stuff like that. It's cool. It stands out as like a unique new kind of species, unlike a lot of the sequel era stuff. That leads him to Kamino, and Obi-Wan gets to have this shock and surprise as he just goes along with what the Prime Minister of Kamino is saying, and he's just like, "Oh yes, I'm here to inspect the army. They're fantastic, just what we've been looking for." And you're reacting like, "Sifo Dyas, who is that?" And he's like, "Sifo Dyas was killed like 10 years ago. What's going on here?" Because it's the timing on it is so weird as well, because like the scroll for this movie tells us that it is a debate within the Senate, should we have a Grand Army of the Republic? And then Obi-Wan finds out that there's been one growing from a group of cloners for 10 years, where the source material is Jango Fett, the bounty hunter. And this is the origin of Boba Fett, the character who, you know, I think will always go down as just the character who, like, just for looking cool, has been just this well-respected character within the franchise. And so it was so weird to see people freak out when we found out that actually Boba Fett is a clone of Jango Fett, and you know, people were so upset about that. But you know, I like that there was some depth given here, that actually, you know, this is the guy who is the source for the clones. The reason it's called the Clone Wars is because it was clones of him, and that creates actually a very interesting situation with like Boba, you know, having to deal with the fact that, you know, there are all these other clones that look exactly like him, but he's the only unaltered one. So yeah, that was cool to get to see him, and I think like this is an example of how you do that sort of character correct. Like you have, I think in each of the trilogies we sort of have had so far that cool looking character who, you know, isn't the main character, but they have to use them correctly. You have Boba Fett for the originals, you have Jango Fett for the prequels, and you have Captain Phasma for like the sequels. And you have like, okay, Boba Fett's fine, you know, very solid, you know, he caught on, you know, people like him. You have Phasma, who ultimately most people would probably agree, not done particularly well. The book Phasma is quite good, but in the movies, nothing going on at all. Very poor use of a very interesting character design and actor. And then you have Jango, who I think gets used pretty well here with the setup of like, he's working for Count Dooku, you know, he's getting paid for this, of course, but he's also sort of been used a little bit in this as well, and that like Obi-Wan comes after him, and he actually has a really cool fight with Obi-Wan and manages to get away. He showcases all the different gadgets, the use of the armor and stuff like that. He has the ship. He gets to have a very cool ship-to-ship fight with Obi-Wan. And then in the middle of the Colosseum, he gets to kill a Jedi, be right there next to Count Dooku. And then, even though he's killed in the movie he's introduced, he's killed by Mace Windu, of all characters. Like, that's a really, really, you know, good arc just in one movie of like it doesn't take anything away from how strong Jango Fett was, that, you know, Mace Windu, arguably like the most powerful, the best fighter of a Jedi that we've ever seen, is the one to take him out. after he had just taken out the, I think the reek animal is the one he took out, Django took out. So that's very, very kind of cool to see there. And then, yeah, just I suppose that, like, even Mace Windu here as, like, you know, you get to see a little bit more of him than we saw in The Phantom Menace, and the setup for, like, why is he second in command on the Jedi Council? Well, you know, for one, you know, he's got the unique purple lightsaber, which, of course, like, the reason for that is just that Sam Jackson just wanted to stand out in his scenes, even though he was a Jedi, by having a lightsaber color that was different, and so purple lightsaber. But it also makes him seem so cool that he is this very unique Jedi, known to be, like, the most powerful, the one who sort of, you know, almost touches the darkness with, like, how powerful he is, has the lightsaber color that gets the closest to being, you know, the Sith, and is the unique color. Very, very cool, and just getting to see some of his kind of personality here as just he stands up to Dooku, like, Oni Jedi, surrounded by all these important people, very dangerous situation. He's just like, this party's over, and ends up, you know, dealing with Jango Fett like that, and it gets across that, you know, at least in episode 2, this is how strong Mace Windu is compared to, say, Obi-Wan. And it shows that Obi-Wan still had a lot of growing to go through as we move into episode 3, which I suppose I'll cover the lightsaber fights here while, you know, we're not too far into the video. I like that this, of all the prequels, is the movie that doesn't go huge with the lightsaber fights. Like, I think not many people rank the stuff that we get here as being, you know, the top tier lightsaber fights in the franchise. And I like that we actually just get a lot of quick lightsaber fights here, in terms of they saved the 2-on-1 Anakin Obi-Wan fight versus Dooku for episode 3. So the way it ends up working is that you get Obi-Wan versus Dooku, then Dooku versus Anakin, and then Yoda versus Dooku. Just all quick, one after the other, all kind of showing a different style of things. And that's, again, what really stands out here. In episode 1, The Duel of the Fates, it told a story as well as just being a really cool action sequence. The same here. Obi-Wan tries to come up with a plan. Anakin just charges in, gets taken out of the fight very early on, and Obi-Wan, despite being very, very solid, is ultimately taken out by a more impressive duelist, which is what you get across with Dooku, and the style that he has with his lightsaber. The curved hilt is a very cool thing of just not being as flashy as the double-bladed lightsaber, but still showing that, like, oh, this guy's got a bit of style going on here. He primarily does it one-handed, so the curved grip kind of helps him. Very, very, very interesting. Along with the fact that, of course, with Dooku, we learn in this movie that he is Qui-Gon's master and Yoda's apprentice. That's where he stands. And him as the guy who left the Order, the now traitor to the Jedi Order. Very, very cool character. Amazing actor for him. Very, very impressive role overall. And so, okay, back to the fights. Obi-Wan goes down, but, you know, he does enough so that the injuries he suffers aren't huge. Like, he's defensive enough that he only gets, you know, cut in the arm, cut in the leg, but he's out of the fight. Then Anakin gets back up. We get a temporary use of dual lightsabers, one in each hand, which is a sort of new, unique style. Very quickly, Dooku disposes of one of the lightsabers, and then we get some reasonably impressive, you know, Anakin versus Dooku stuff, but he leaves himself too open, and unlike the solid Obi-Wan, Anakin leaves himself wide open, gets his arm cut off. So that's the first limb lost for, you know, setting up Darth Vader, which was interesting in that they sort of teased it as well earlier on, in that you think, is Anakin going to lose his hand in the droid factory sequence when he gets his arm, you know, placed with the kind of droid arm around it and stuff like that? But no, they kind of just hint at it and then come back to it later on. And then Yoda walks in, and this is a cool thing because you need to set up how strong Yoda is in terms of his everything. And I like this. This is master versus apprentice here. So Dooku tries to see how do his now that he is a Sith Lord, how do his Force abilities stack up against Yoda? So they start throwing stuff at each other. Even nothing going on here. So he goes to the thing that makes him sort of unique as a Sith, the power that makes him unique. The Sith lightning, And unlike Obi-Wan, who just blocked it with his lightsaber, which was still pretty impressive, Yoda just blocks it with his hand. That he's so skilled enough that he's able to, like the front of the box shows, he's able to just, block it and redirect it. Lightning redirection before Avatar did it. It's very, very impressive. And so he's like, okay, we can't settle this with force powers. It'll have to be with our skills with a lightsaber. And everyone's waiting to see, how does Yoda fight? He's so tiny. He can barely move most of the time. How is he going to have a lightsaber fight against this guy who just beat Obi-Wan and Anakin? And they completely surprise you, but it ultimately sort of had to be the way that they went about it. Yoda, just because of his size, couldn't fight in the same way that Obi-Wan did against Dooku. He couldn't fight in the same way Anakin did. So he does the thing you least expect him to do, and that is just hop around the place like a wild thing. Just constant flipping, constant spinning, keeping Dooku on the defensive. That this is the counter to Dooku's style, which is very technical, and he's controlling the angles in most of his fights. But here, Yoda is just everywhere because he's spinning so much that he puts Dooku on the defensive, and when Dooku is on the defensive, he's not as good. So very quickly, Dooku realizes he has to escape, and so he does. And yeah, they don't really settle anything here, even though Anakin's pretty badly injured, Obi-Wan gets some cuts. Everyone survives this, and it's just a setup for, towards the end of the war, we'll see some of these fights come to fruition, and we actually do get that. So, I think very, very solid, well choreographed in that, even though these are the probably on the lesser side of the duels that we see in the prequels, they still are so much better than like a lot of what's come before, both in the originals and of course in the sequels, which are known to have very bad choreography for their lightsaber fighting. I really hope episode 9 manages to get that right, in that please consult Nick Gillard to actually do lightsaber fighting properly. I'm sure by now a lot of people have seen the breakdowns of the throne room sequence from episode 8 that really highlights just how bad and awful that fight scene was. In that they just need to look at any lightsaber on lightsaber battle that we get in the prequels for this is how you do it. That's how you do choreography in a lightsaber fight. What else is there to talk about here? I suppose I pretty much covered most of the stuff. There's so many little details I could get into here and there. But the Obi-Wan Dooku scene where, they have Obi-Wan captured is very, very interesting in that Dooku just tells Obi-Wan the truth in a way here of just join me and we'll defeat the Sith, because I've just told you that a Sith Lord named Darth Sidious is in control of the Senate. And by the end of the movie, Obi-Wan is asking Mace Windu, that can't be true, can it? That there's a Sith Lord in control of things? And they're just no, we've lost the ability to sort of sense the immediate future. The dark side has clouded our ability to sort of access that kind of part of the Force. Very, very interesting. And it's one of those interesting things where they even in this movie say that they figured out our weakness, that this it's explained in Darth Plagueis that a Sith Lord 1 or 2 before Plagueis, I think it was, did this, and it actually hindered for generations the Jedi's ability to sort of sense the future, that this is something that needed to happen so that the ultimate Sith plan could happen. Otherwise, the Jedi will be able to sort of sense overall anything happening here. And it's only this sort of cloud of darkness that kind of allows all of this stuff to go on behind the scenes. So just little setups like that I think are important to get. And then it's just one line of dialogue from Dooku within that back and forth that just gets across so much information. It's where he reveals he was my apprentice as you were once his. And Qui-Gon wouldn't stand for what's going on right now in the Republic. He's getting across the idea. Qui-Gon was this kind of roguish Jedi in episode 1. how would he have thought about the whole separatist movement and the way the Republic is right now? And you do wonder, with his different view on things, how things would go differently. In that, like, would Qui-Gon be siding with the separatists, and would he have brought, like, the likes of Anakin and Obi-Wan with him or not? It just goes to, again, highlight how important, you know, the death of Qui-Gon was in terms of, like, really changing the way things could have gone. Just anything that makes Qui-Gon out to sort of be an important player in this, I think I'm all for. Other than that, just you know, Padme, again, not just in the romance, but just throughout this movie, constantly being involved in the action throughout. That she is right there, willing to go with Anakin here, here, and here to help him if he needs something done. But then when the action hits, she's all over it. Like, she picks the lock in her handcuffs to set up how she's able to, you know, fight against the monster that's about to take her out. She comes up with, you know, she's right there at the front, basically coming up with some of, like, the battle strategies in the middle of this. Like, she's picking up the kind of chariot thing, Anakin hops on it, and so on. She's on the gunship at the end, you know, taking everything out. It's just a really good characterization that they didn't forget that in episode 1, Padme was also sort of leading the charge, and she's doing the same here, even though it's in the middle of a war zone this time, rather than just a sort of, like, skirmish in the palace. She's still able to be that, you know, strong, even on a full-scale battlefield. And again, like, a final point is just, like, the clones themselves. It's so cool getting to see them, and all the different you know, vehicles that come in. The LAAT, the LAAT gunship is such a memorable prequel era ship for me. It's just so cool. The shape of it, the sliding open doors, the bubble pod lasers that are on the sides, as just a kind of troop lander ship. It's very, very memorable for me. And you can see how this eventually transitions into the Empire, because the clones do look very similar to stormtroopers, and, like, the walker that the clones have will eventually evolve into the AT-AT and so on. And just nice sort of visual storytelling there with that sort of stuff, and that there is actually an evolution. Like, you look at the evolution of, say, that to where we are in the originals to, like, the walker we get in episode 8, and it's like, I would have preferred to see something a little bit more, and it feels like they've sort of missed out on that with just some of the technology of it's a better X-Wing and stuff like that. Whereas, like, in episode 3 that we're going to get to next, we're going to see the ARC 170 starfighter with the triple foil wings evolve into the X-Wing, and then evolve into just the X-Wing, where the split also includes the intake bit, and that's the only real difference. But anyway, that's my thoughts on Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. Next week we will do Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, my favorite Star Wars movie, so I'm very excited for that. But in the comments, let me know what your thoughts were on Episode 2. But that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.